Chapter 9. The Quran is borrowed from both Jewish and Christian myths. The doings and sayings of Moses and Abraham and Jesus, being so ill-founded and so inconsistent, as well as so often immoral, one must proceed in the same spirit of inquiry to what many believe is the last revelation, that of the Prophet Muhammad and his Quran or recitation. Here again, the angel or archangel, Gabriel, is found at work, dictating surahs or verses to a person of little or no learning. Here again are stories of a Noah-like flood, and injunctions against idol worship. Here again the Jews are the first recipients of the message, and the first both to hear it and to discard it. And here again there is a vast commentary of doubtful anecdote about the actual doings and sayings of the Prophet, this time known as the Hadith. Islam is at once the most and the least interesting of the world's monotheisms. It builds upon its primitive Jewish and Christian predecessors, selecting a chunk here and a shard there, and thus if these fall, it partly falls also. Its founding narrative likewise takes place within an astonishingly small compass, and relates facts about extremely tedious local quarrels. None of the original documents, such as they are, can be contrasted with any Hebrew or Greek or Latin texts. Almost all of the tradition is oral, and all of it is in Arabic. Indeed, many authorities agree that the Quran is only intelligible in that tongue, which is itself subject to innumerable idiomatic and regional inflections. This would leave us on the face of it with the absurd and potentially dangerous conclusion that God was a monoglot. Before me is a book introducing Muhammad, written by two extremely unctuous British Muslims who are hoping to present a friendly version of Islam to the West. Ingratiating and selective as their text may be, they insist that, as the literal word of God, the Quran is the Quran, only in the original revealed text. A translation can never be the Quran, that inimitable symphony, the very sound of which moves men and women to tears. A translation can only be an attempt to give the barest suggestion of the meaning of words contained in the Quran. This is why all Muslims, whatever their mother tongue, always recite the Quran in its original Arabic. The authors go on to make some highly disobliging observations about the Penguin translation by N.J. Dawood, which makes me glad that I have always employed the Pictorial version, but no likelier to be convinced that if I wish to become a convert, I must master another language. In my own country of birth, I am sadly aware that there is a beautiful, poetic tradition unavailable to me, because I will never know the marvellous tongue called Gaelic. Even if God is or was an Arab, an unsafe assumption, how could he expect to reveal himself by way of an illiterate person who in turn could not possibly hope to pass on the unaltered, let alone unalterable, words? The point may seem minor, but it is not. To Muslims, the enunciation of the divine to a person of extreme unlettered simplicity has something of the same value as the humble vessel of the Virgin Mary has to Christians. It also possesses the same useful merit of being entirely unverifiable and unfalsifiable. Since Mary must be presumed to have spoken Aramaic and Muhammad Arabic, it can, I suppose, be granted that God is in fact multilingual and can speak any language he chooses. He opted in both cases to use the Archangel Gabriel as the intermediate deliverer of his message. However, the impressive fact remains that all religions have staunchly resisted any attempt to translate their sacred texts into languages understanded of the people, as the Cranmer Prayer Book phrases it. There would have been no Protestant Reformation if it were not for the long struggle to have the Bible rendered into the Vulgate, and the priestly monopoly therefore broken. Devout men like Wycliffe, Coverdale, and Tyndale were burned alive for even attempting early translations. The Catholic Church has never recovered from its abandonment of the mystifying Latin ritual, and the Protestant mainstream has suffered hugely from rendering its own Bibles into more everyday speech. Some mystical Jewish sects still insist on Hebrew and play Kabbalistic word games even with the spaces between letters, but, among most Jews too, the supposedly unchangeable rituals of antiquity have been abandoned. The spell of the clerical class has been broken. Only in Islam has there been no reformation, and to this day any vernacular version of the Quran must still be printed with an Arabic parallel text. This ought to arouse suspicion, even in the slowest mind. Later Muslim conquests, impressive in their speed and scope and decisiveness, have lent point to the idea that these Arabic incantations must have had something to them. But if you allow this cheap earthly victory as a proof, you allow the same to Joshua's blood-soaked tribesmen, or to the Christian crusaders and conquistadors. There is a further objection. All religions take care to silence or to execute those who question them, and I choose to regard this recurrent tendency as a sign of their weakness rather than their strength. It has, however, been some time since Judaism and Christianity resorted openly to torture and censorship. Not only did Islam begin by condemning all doubters to eternal fire, but it still claims the right to do so in almost all of its dominions, and still preaches that these dominions can and must be extended by war. There has never been an attempt in any age to challenge or even investigate the claims of Islam that has not been met with extremely harsh and swift repression. Provisionally, then, one is entitled to conclude that the apparent unity and confidence of the faith is a mask for a very deep and probably justifiable insecurity. That there are, and always have been, sanguinary feuds between different schools of Islam, resulting in strictly inter-Muslim accusations of heresy and profanity, and in terrible acts of violence, naturally goes without saying. I have tried my best with this religion, which is as foreign to me as it is to the many millions who will always doubt that God entrusted a non-reader, through an intermediary, with the demanding call to read. As I said, I long ago acquired a copy of the Marmaduke Pictorial translation of the Quran, which has been certified by senior sources in the ulema, or Islamic religious authority, to be the nearest to an approximate rendition into English. I have been to innumerable gatherings, from Friday prayers in Tehran, to mosques in Damascus and Jerusalem and Doha and Istanbul and Washington, D.C., and I can attest that the recitation in Arabic does indeed have the apparent power to create bliss and also rage among those who hear it. I have also attended prayers in Malaysia and Indonesia and Bosnia, where there is resentment among non-Arabic-speaking Muslims at the privilege granted to Arabs into Arabic, and to Arab movements and regimes, in a religion that purports to be universal. I have in my own home received Sayyid Hossein Khomeini, grandson of the Ayatollah, and a cleric from the holy city of Qum, and carefully handed him my own copy of the Quran. He kissed it, discussed it at length and with reverence, and for my instruction wrote in the back flap the verses which he thought had disproved his grandfather's claim to clerical authority in this world, as well as overthrown his grandfather's claim to take the life of Salman Rushdie. Who am I to adjudicate in such a dispute? However, the idea that the identical text can yield different commandments to different people is quite familiar to me for other reasons. There's no need to overstate the difficulty of understanding Islam's alleged profundities. If one comprehends the fallacies of any revealed religion, one comprehends them all. I have only once, in 25 years of often heated arguments in Washington, D.C., been threatened with actual violence. This was when I was at dinner with some staffers and supporters of the Clinton White House. One of those present, a then well-known Democratic pollster and fundraiser, questioned me about my own most recent trip to the Middle East. He wanted my opinion as to why the Muslims were so all-fired goddamn fundamentalist. I ran through my repertoire of explanations, adding that it was often forgotten that Islam was a relatively young faith and still in the heat of its self-confidence. Not for Muslims the crisis of self-doubt that had overtaken Western Christianity. I added that, for example, while there was little or no evidence for the life of Jesus, the figure of the Prophet Muhammad was by contrast a person in ascertainable history. The man changed colour faster than anyone had ever seen. After shrieking that Jesus Christ had meant more to more people than I could ever imagine, and that I was disgusting beyond words for speaking so casually, he drew back his foot and aimed a kick which only his decency, conceivably his Christianity, prevented him from landing on my shin. He then ordered his wife to join him in leaving. I now feel that I owe him an apology, or at least half of one. Although we do know that a person named Muhammad almost certainly existed within a fairly small bracket of time and space, we have the same problem as we do in all the precedent cases. The accounts that relate his deeds and words were assembled many years later and are hopelessly corrupted into incoherence by self-interest, rumour, and illiteracy. The tale is familiar enough, even if it is new to you. Some Meccans of the 7th century followed an Abrahamic tradition, and even believed that their temple, the Kaaba, had been built by Abraham. The temple itself, most of its original furnishings having been destroyed by later fundamentalists, notably the Wahhabis, is said to have become depraved by idolatry. Muhammad, the son of Abdullah, became one of those Hunafa, who turned away to seek solace elsewhere. The book of Isaiah also enjoins true believers to come out from the ungodly and be separate. Retiring to a desert cave on Mount Hira for the month of heat or Ramadan, he was asleep or in a trance, I'm quoting Pictoul's commentary, when he heard a voice commanding him to read. He replied twice that he was unable to read, and was thrice commanded to do so. Eventually asking what he should read, he was further commanded in the name of a Lord who created man from a clot of blood. After the angel Gabriel, who so identified himself, had told Muhammad that he was to be Allah's messenger and had departed, Muhammad confided in his wife, Khadijah. On their return to Mecca, she took him to meet her cousin, an elderly man named Waraka ibn Nufal, who knew the scriptures of the Jews and Christians. This whiskered veteran declared that the divine envoy who once visited Moses had come again to Mount Hira. From then on, Muhammad adopted the modest title of Slave of Allah, the latter word being simply the Arabic for God. The only people who at first took the smallest interest in Muhammad's claim were the greedy guardians of the temple at Mecca, who saw it as a threat to their pilgrimage business, and the studious Jews of Yathrib, a town 200 miles distant, who had been for some time proclaiming the advent of the Messiah. The first group became more threatening, and the second more friendly, as a result of which Muhammad made the journey, or Hijra, to Yathrib, which is now known as Medina. The date of the flight counts as the inauguration of the Muslim era. But as with the arrival of the Nazarene in Jewish Palestine, which began with so many cheerful heavenly auguries, this was all to end very badly, with the realization on the part of the Arabian Jews that they were faced with yet another disappointment, if not indeed another impostor. According to Karen Armstrong, one of the most sympathetic, not to say apologetic, analysts of Islam, the Arabs of the time had a wounded feeling that they had been left out of history. God had appeared to Christians and Jews, but he had sent the Arabs no prophet and no scripture in their own language. Thus, though she does not put it this way, the time for someone to have a local revelation was long overdue, and once having had it, Muhammad was not inclined to let it be criticized as second-hand by adherents of older faiths. The record of his 7th century career, like the books of the Old Testament, swiftly becomes an account of vicious quarrels between a few hundred or sometimes a few thousand unlearned villagers and townspeople, in which the finger of God was supposed to settle and determine the outcome of parochial disputes. As with the primeval bloodlettings of the Sinai and Canaan, which are likewise unattested by any independent evidence, millions of people have been held hostage ever since by the supposedly providential character of these ugly squabbles. There is some question as to whether Islam is a separate religion at all. It initially fulfilled a need among Arabs for a distinctive or special creed, and is forever identified with their language and their impressive later conquests, which, while not as striking as those of the young Alexander of Macedonia, certainly conveyed an idea of being backed by a divine will, until they petered out at the fringes of the Balkans and the Mediterranean. But Islam, when examined, is not much more than a rather obvious and ill-arranged set of plagiarisms, helping itself from earlier books and traditions as occasion appeared to require. Thus, far from being born in the clear light of history, as Ernest Renan so generously phrased it, Islam in its origins is just as shady and approximate as those from which it took its borrowings. It makes immense claims for itself, invokes prostrate submission or surrender as a maxim to its adherents, and demands deference and respect from non-believers into the bargain. There is nothing, absolutely nothing, in its teachings that can even begin to justify such arrogance and presumption. The Prophet died in the year 632 of our own approximate calendar. The first account of his life was set down a full 120 years later by Ibn Ishaq, whose original was lost and can only be consulted through its reworked form, authored by Ibn Hisham, who died in 834. Adding to this hearsay and obscurity, there is no agreed-upon account of how the Prophet's followers assembled the Quran, or of how his various sayings, some of them written down by secretaries, became codified. And this familiar problem is further complicated, even more than in the Christian case, by the matter of succession. Unlike Jesus, who apparently undertook to return to earth very soon, and who, Pache, the absurd Dan Brown, left no known descendants, Muhammad was a general and a politician, and though, unlike Alexander of Macedonia, a prolific father, left no instruction as to who was to take up his mantle. Quarrels over the leadership began almost as soon as he died, and so Islam had its first major schism between the Sunni and the Shia before it had even established itself as a system. We need take no side in the schism, except to point out that one at least of the schools of interpretation must be quite mistaken. and the initial identification of Islam with an earthly caliphate made up of disputatious contenders for the said mantle marked it from the very beginning as man-made.